Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر، الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله فإن الله تعالى مع المتقين. وبعد. If we look through our long history, our great history, our history which brings us all together, a history based upon Iman, not based upon color or race or ethnicity or nation. If we look to our history, we find great examples of men and women, young and old, from various parts of the world, who sacrificed a great amount in order for us today to practice the Islam that we are practicing. Whether the sacrifice was a sacrifice of wealth, a sacrifice of time, a sacrifice of mental and emotional capacity, or a sacrifice of life, or even members of family, the sacrifice was the same, and the sacrifice had the same reason, and that reason was the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Our history is full of men and women who put forward for the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that which they would not have otherwise put forward. Men and women who chose the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in their lives over their own pleasure, appetites, passions and desires. And this is something which has been touched upon through various khutbahs over perhaps the past few months, which ties into purpose, the purpose behind our existence. There is a very famous statement that I'm sure we all know, and some of us may even use. Time is money. But that statement is a summary of a philosophy upon which modern societies operate. That your time, your existence, your body, your mind, everything you have should be used for the sake of capital gain. If you are not using what you have for capital gain, i.e. financial gain, tangible gain, then you are wasting what you have. And you can apply this even, unfortunately, in the arena of Islam, where you will find that a person does not value the knowledge that they may acquire unless they can use it to make money. Where an Imam does not value the work that he may do unless he is making money from that work. Where a scholar has to think about the financial quantification of his work before thinking about sincerity. Why? Because, as is said in Arabic, al-mar'u ibnu asrihi, a man is the son of his time. And if you are not aware of the time that you are living in, you very quickly become a product of that time and you don't feel it or realize it. Likewise, apply this in the home. The man is not valued by his wife unless he's bringing in some sort of financial gain. He is not valued for his character, for his deen, for his presence with his children, if he's not bringing in the money. And it's not only capital of a financial quantity, but even that which we consider to be pleasurable capital, if that's a word that is correct. Capital of pleasure. The man looks at his wife in the same way. He doesn't consider her values. He doesn't consider her morality. He doesn't consider her character. He doesn't consider her presence as a mother. He looks at her with one eye, the eye of pleasure. Is she pleasuring me or not? Why is that the case? Because we live in a society which is built upon tangible capital, tangible profit. If I cannot profitize it, it's not worth my time. But if you look at our history presents a people that did not consider the financial profit or the capital, tangible profit that could be attained in this life. It was that which they could acquire in the next life, which was their spark, which was their purpose, which was their battery that kept them going. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us this in a very simple verse, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. A verse which we have heard over and over again. A verse which we come across perhaps in many of the lectures that are given, especially when talking about the importance of worship and so on and so forth. But ibadah is not simply prayer, is not simply zakah, as has been mentioned before. And the underlying core to ibadah is putting the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala before my own pleasure. Some of the ulama, when they speak about the ibadat from a spiritual perspective, they speak about the purpose of the existence of the ibadat. One that's coming up soon, Ramadan. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الصِّيَامِ. Of course, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. And the end of the verse, what? لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. So that you will acquire taqwa, or so that you may acquire taqwa. The purpose behind the siyam is what? Taqwa. Who acquires the taqwa? Not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course. Us. Likewise, the salah. What's the point in the salah? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not need our salah, but we need the salah. The salah reminds us. The salah refines us. The salah purifies us. Say the same about zakah. Look at society today, how greedy society has become, how self-centered society has become, how individualistic society has become. But a person who knows that they have to give zakah and a person who is giving zakah regularly, this is a prevention to the sickness that we see in front of us today. In fact, in the UK today, I was informed that non-Muslim charities are now setting up zakah departments because they have clearly noticed that the Muslim community in the UK is the most charitable community. And so what do they want to do? They want to prophetize that, of course. As that's the philosophy of the day. Let's prophetize it. Going back to the point. Likewise, Hajj. Likewise, recitation of the Quran. There's reward in reciting the Quran, but why? What's the point in the reward? Not so we can sit there, read it, get reward, and do nothing with it. No, it's so that we can understand and apply it. So that we can understand and apply it. An incentive to understand, which will lead to application. And of course, one can say it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy, without a shadow of a doubt. But the point is, our history provides us with men and women who sacrificed their lives, every aspect of their lives, for the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we referred to the statement, time is money. But if we look at the verse, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, I have not created man and jinn except but to worship. The purpose behind our time, the purpose behind it is not money, but it's what? Worship. Therefore, every moment that I am not worshipping within, I am wasting that moment. I am wasting that moment. Every single moment that I do not use for ibadah, on Yawm al-Qiyamah, I will look back potentially and say, if only I used that moment of my life for some worship. Ya laytani qaddamtu li hayati, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that the non-Muslims will say. Likewise, the Muslims will look back. Those that acquire paradise, they will look back and they will wish that they utilized more time for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake. They will wish that they used more time. So we look at our time as money. Perhaps some of you here right now are thinking, I need to go back to work. I need to go back to work. When is this going to end? Maybe you're forced to think like that because of the timetable, etc. But do we think the same way when we're at work? I need to go and worship. When we're using our time for that which really has no significance, do we think about the purpose of time? I need to worship. I need to use some time today to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Do we think about that when we're with our families? What purpose am I serving by being a husband here? What purpose am I serving by being a father here? Do we think about that in society? What purpose am I serving by existing in the UK today? Do I have a purpose? Am I serving a purpose? What should that purpose be? And a question can be asked, why? Why should I have a purpose? Or why should I put Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's pleasure before my own? The incentive behind the purpose is the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us when referring to the dunya about the alternative option, the akhirah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about His pleasure. And we find likewise in the ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Why? What's the reason for putting the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala before my own pleasure? Let's give some examples. I'm feeling lazy. It's time to pray. I'm feeling lazy. I don't use that time to pray. Let's say I have 2 hours to pray between Dhuhr and Asr. I don't use that time. I don't use it to pray. Perhaps I'm laying down. Perhaps I'm sitting down. Perhaps I'm enjoying a conversation with my friend or companion, etc. What am I going to get from that time if I don't pray? I might get some pleasure. I might get some comfort. I might get some sleep or some rest. But ultimately, that comfort or pleasure or fulfillment that I get in that time is momentary. At the end of the day, is the feeling of the pleasure I took or I received in the middle of the day going to be with me? No. No sign of that pleasure is going to be there. In fact, you might be happy midday and then completely and utterly depressed at the end of the day. The happiness doesn't help the depression. And the next morning you might feel happy again. The depression doesn't do anything to the happiness. Momentary. You have a bad day today, you forget the good day you had yesterday. You have a bad year, you forget the good year that came before it. Momentary. You enjoy the first sip of a drink, the first bite of some food. By the end of it, especially if you're full up, you don't want to eat anymore. You might even feel sick of the food, sick of drink. The pleasure doesn't last. But what happens when you put the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first? When you put that which is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first. The pleasure that you gain may not come to you in this life. Perhaps the salah is difficult. Perhaps it's difficult for you. Perhaps the zakah, you actually really want that money. Perhaps fasting, you hate it, you don't enjoy it. But what happens? You acquire the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the consequence of which is eternal. Eternal. If Allah is pleased with you, you acquire eternal contentment, eternal pleasure, eternal fulfillment of passions and appetites and desires. Versus in this life, momentary. Momentary. If you have a man on his deathbed and he lived the best of lives, and you ask him about the pleasures and the contentment and the happiness that he felt throughout his life, is there any benefit to it now? He'll say, of course not. Of course not. A person dying does not look back and say, I'm so happy that I had that extra time for comfort. I'm so happy I ate an extra meal on that day. I'm so happy that I had to experience these drinks and so on and so forth. They don't. They look back with regret. They look back with regret. Whereas the person who has sacrificed that which he has for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on his deathbed looks back with hope. With hope. And only looks back with regret at the fact that perhaps they didn't sacrifice enough. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, إِنَّ الدُّنْيَا حُلْوَةٌ خَجَرَةٌ وَإِنَّ اللَّهَ مُسْتَخْلِفُكُمْ فِيهِ أو فيها فينظر كيف تعملون. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is looking at the way we interact with this lush and green environment that He has given us. But this lush and green environment is a test. That's it. And the way that we interact with this test, are we going to sacrifice what we have, or are we going to sacrifice what we may acquire in the akhirah for the sake of something we might have in this life? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He informs us of the reality of this life, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives it a similarity to something that we engage in every single day. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ اشْتَرَى مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ أَنفُسَهُمْ وَأَمْوَالَهُمْ بِأَنَّ لَهُمُ الْجَنَّةِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says that He has purchased from the believers their lives and their wealth for the price of paradise. For the price of paradise. Those who believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and sacrifice for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake, they are sacrificing in exchange for eternal pleasure. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also refers to those that acquire this life over the next, whether speaking about the nations that came before us, or the munafiqun, or those who Islam reaches them but they refuse to accept it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that they are selling that which is with Allah for a small price. Something which is not worth the exchange that is being made. And so the point to reflect upon is that when we look at who we were and who we can be, we have to understand that it is going to be in the future, and it was based upon in the past, sacrifice for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake. And sacrifice for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake means the willingness to sacrifice the moments in our lives. Don't just look at the big picture. Look at the small picture. Every moment is a moment that can be used for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If I spend 10 minutes reciting the Quran, that's 10 minutes of sacrifice for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake. Whereas if I spend 10 minutes playing a computer game, that's 10 minutes that I haven't sacrificed for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake. Time is not money, time is worship. Time is worship. If you take the opinion of the ulama that say that everything around us has been created for our sake, for the sake of mankind, for this test that we find ourselves in, then everything has been created for the sake of worship. Everything. And everything that we have is a test. And everything that we don't have is a test. And when you change your mindset, and rather than saying time is money, but you say time is worship, you start to appreciate things differently. You don't pay too much attention to the finances, but you pay more attention to the acts of righteousness. You don't hold those who have made money in high esteem anymore, but you hold those who have sacrificed for the sake of Allah in high esteem. You don't look up to the billionaires and the millionaires, but you look up to the individuals who have sacrificed that which they have in order to acquire the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whether they are male or female, young or old, whether they are the huffaz of the Quran who sacrificed hours and minutes for the sake of memorizing the Quran, whether they are ulama, whether they are champions of Islam, mujahideen, whether they are great leaders, they all fall into the same camp. And this is a very important part of our philosophy, the way that we look at the world that we interact with. Do we look at it as money to be made or worship to be enacted? أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. الحمد لله وحده وصلوات ربي وسلامه على أشرف الأنبياء ومن تبعه وبعد. So, if I look at the world and I say time is worship, and I understand that worship is not simply the ritualistic acts that we engage in. It's not simply to pray 5 times a day and to give zakah and to fast. That's not worship alone. That's an aspect of worship. But I understand that worship is to live my life for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The question that comes next, how do I do that? How do I do that? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He gives us a verse which clarifies this question. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, فَلَا وَرَبِّكَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ حَتَّى يُحَكِّمُوكَ فِي مَا شَجَرَ بَيْنَهُمْ ثُمَّ لَا يَجِدُوا فِي أَنفُسِهِمْ حَرَجًا مِمَّا قَضَيْتَ وَيُسَلِّمُوا تَسْلِيمًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, they will not believe, they will not have true iman until they come to you, i.e. the Messenger of Allah alayhi salatu wasalam, and they make you the judge in their affairs and their disputes, and they surrender themselves to that which you give of ruling, and they do not find in themselves any discomfort with that which you say, i.e. with the judgment and the rulings that you give. That's the state of being in a position of submission and sacrifice to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what do we learn from the verse? That we need to understand the rulings of Islam, the framework of Islam, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam as understood by the Sahaba. And alhamdulillah, Allah has made it easy for us. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us a chain of scholars that preserved for us the understanding of the Sahaba, peer-reviewed, generation after generation after generation. And you find people teaching the understanding of the Sahaba today in the schools of fiqh, for example. But it's not only fiqh, it's also issues of the heart. Issues of the heart. The Prophet ﷺ, what did he say to Umar radiallahu ta'ala? That you will not have complete iman until I am more beloved to you than yourself and your family, etc. And Umar, he didn't understand this. How? And he went away, he came back and he said, now you're more beloved to me, Ya Rasulullah, than my own self. Which shows there has to be action of the heart when it comes to sacrificing for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the moments and the minutes and the hours and the days and weeks and months and years that Allah has given us. It's a lifelong journey. It's a philosophy, a way of living, a way of looking at the world, a way of understanding. And we can look at some examples today where we might be sacrificing for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake and putting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's pleasure over our own pleasure. And we can also look at examples where we're clearly not doing that. The first, eating halal and staying away from the haram. Most Muslims, alhamdulillah, will only consume that which is halal. Why? Because they understand, I can't eat this. It's haram. That's putting Allah's pleasure before your own pleasure. Non-halal meat, for example, is cheaper. But we don't eat it. Why? Because we know it's haram. The hijab. Sisters wearing the hijab and abaya or wearing modest clothing, etc. in a time where the norm is to reveal your body and to beautify yourselves every time you go out. That's a form of putting Allah's pleasure before the pleasure of the self. That's a form of sacrifice for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake. But then we have other examples. And perhaps you can group these examples into two categories. Individual instances where we're not sacrificing, we're not putting Allah's pleasure before our own. And collective instances where we're not putting Allah's pleasure before our own as a collective. And the individual ties into the collective. A collective is made up of individuals. If you have a group of bent sticks, the group, when you tie them together, will be bent. If they are straight, the group together, when tied, will be straight. And so when I work on myself, I'm working on my ummah. And I cannot work on my ummah if I'm not working on myself. An example where we're not putting Allah's pleasure before our own. The men that are not taking care of their families. The men that have children but they're globe-trotting and acting like they're young without responsibility, not concerned for the well-being of their children that they've left behind. That's putting the pleasure of yourself over the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You marry a woman, you have children with her, but then you don't take care of your children. And you might even go off and get married again and forget about the children that you had with that woman. That's not from Islam. And that's putting your pleasure before the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in so many areas and so many ways. Likewise, women, a trend we have today, where women, for example, traveling the world without mahram, going on holiday without mahram, taking pictures of themselves in Dubai and Qatar and Turkey, having a good time without a mahram. This is something which is understood by most Muslims. And when told, no, this is haram, what's the answer? Oh, but I don't have a mahram, it's difficult. Okay, the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should be put before your own pleasure here. Likewise, the men. My wife, she's difficult. The children, it's difficult, etc. The pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala before your own pleasure. It's a test. It's supposed to be hard. A test is not easy. If a test was easy, it wouldn't be a test. Likewise, money, where you have individuals that are selling haram. Selling haram. Why? Because they feel impoverished. But the reality is, if you live in the UK, you're not poor. You may be poor in relation to other people that live in the UK but travel the world and see real poverty, and you will understand that you are a wealthy person if you live in the UK. In fact, it can even be said the homeless people in the UK are well off in comparison to the poor people of the rest of the world. They eat and drink the way that some people in other countries don't eat and drink, even if they have money. And then what happens? I need to make money. I'll make it in a haram way. Where's the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala over your own pleasure, your own passion, your own desires, your own appetites? Where's the application? It's easy to say I'm a Muslim and pray 5 times a day. That's easy. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, Buni al-Islamu ala khams. Islam was built upon 5 things. The Prophet ﷺ, he didn't say al-muttaqi, may yusalli khamsa salawat. He didn't say the righteous person is the one who prays 5 times. He said Buni al-Islam. Islam is built. That's the foundation. What builds the house is staying away from the haram. And it's not just haram on the streets. It's not just drugs, for example. It's also the haram being sold in shops. Alcohol, cigarettes, haram meats. On Yawm al-Qiyamah, we're going to be questioned about these things. And by engaging in haram, by traveling without a mahram, by not being a man in my home and leaving my kids in a non-Muslim country without raising them, I am also contributing to what's happening in Gaza, to what's happening in Sudan, to what happened in Burma, to what's going to happen in the Muslim world, generally speaking. Why? Because the collective is made up of sticks, individuals. If you are not doing your due, if you are not doing what you should do, then you are a reason for the problems that we find ourselves in today. That's the reality. That's the reality. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He speaks to us in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to us as a collective. Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu. Oh, you who believe, jama'ah, not individuals. And the problem of our time today is that we don't put Allah's pleasure, we don't put what Allah wants before the pleasure of ourselves and what we want. And just a final point. It's not just the individual aspects of living. The individual aspects of living make up the general way of living. It's a way of life. Islam is a way of life. I cannot take a way of life which is not Islamic and halalify it and justify the halalification of a haram lifestyle. Islam is not a lifestyle of glitz and glamour. Islam is a lifestyle of sacrifice and shunning this dunya. That's what Islam is. The ulama, when they speak about wealth, alhamdulillah, it's halal if it's in the hand, not the heart. But today it's in the heart, even when it's not in the hand. Because we purchase things on finance, we can't afford them. And so we as individuals and we as a collective need to reflect upon our purpose and putting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's pleasure before our own pleasure in every single moment. Every minute is the consequence of the last minute that came before it. Every hour is the consequence of the hour spent prior to it. Every day is the consequence of the day you spent yesterday. If you slack today, tomorrow is going to be more difficult because you're going to have more work to do. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to put His pleasure before our own. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد وارض اللهم عن أبي بكر وعن عمر وعن عثمان وعن علي وعن سائر الصحابة أجمعين اللهم تب علينا واعف عنا إنك أنت مجيب الدعوات اللهم استعملنا في نصرة دينك يا رب العالمين ولا تستبدلنا اللهم انصر إخواننا في غزة وإخواننا في أنحاء العالم يا رب العالمين اللهم ارفع راية الإسلام يا مجيب الدعوات اللهم وفق إخواننا في فلسطين وسدد رميهم وثبت قلوبهم يا مجيب الدعوات وأقم الصلاة